All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on the 2020 Census, Reaching Agricultural Communities. For anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Libby Eiholzer. I work with the Northwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops team. Today, I'm joined by Judson Reid from the Cornell Vegetable Program. Our teams and programs are a collaboration, a partnership with Cornell University and the Cornell Cooperative Extension Associations in the counties in which we work. We both work in a number of counties across Western New York. So the reason that we're putting together this webinar is that Ontario County, the Planning Committee, reached out to Ontario County Cooperative Extension asking to help expand outreach to specifically Mennonite and Spanish-speaking farm workers in those communities within the county. I work with dairy farmers and specifically spend a lot of time with Spanish-speaking farm workers. Judd works with Mennonite and Amish farmers across his region. So we are not necessarily experts on the census, but we've done some research, and we can certainly, basically what we're looking at here is how to apply what we know about these communities to how they might be receptive to and how one could reach out to them about the census. Okay, so we're going to do a basic overview of what the census is and why it's important. And then we're going to go into some special considerations for those specific communities. So I'm sure, everybody knows about the census. Everyone's completed it at some point, but it's a count of the US population that takes place every 10 years since its initiation in 1790. It is a count of everybody living in the United States, whether or not they are citizens. The results of the census help to determine how federal funds are assigned to states and communities, as well as the number of seats each state gets in Congress. One survey needs to be completed per household, and that can be done either online through a pretty simple online survey. It can be done through an over-the-phone telephone interview or by filling out the survey and mailing it in. And then lastly, I didn't even include this, but in-person interviews are also an option. Right now, census enumerators, census workers are going out to households that have not yet responded and requesting to go ahead and help them fill out that survey. And importantly, all of the answers to the census are anonymous. The results are strictly used to create statistics, and they're not, none of the personal private information is actually shared. So the information that's collected is the person's address, who owns the house, whether it's owned or rented or someone's living there rent-free. It asks for a phone number in order to contact the house dwellers on official census business if necessary. And then also the number of people living in the house or on April 1st, 2020, and their name, sex, date of birth and age, race, and whether or not they are of Hispanic origin. The reason that it's April 1st, 2020 is that they want to really avoid having any duplicate answers. They don't want to have people be counted twice. For example, if they were counted where they're like a college student was counted both at their college address and their parents' home address. I just added in here a couple of screenshots of what the form actually looks like. This is a example that you can find at this web address. They also have this in Spanish. So you can see it's pretty specific, tells you who to count, who not to count. And then for each person in the house, these are the questions that it asks. So why should you care? We've got a lot of extension educators on today. We're also hoping to reach out to farmers and basically anyone that might reach these communities. The reasons are that the benefits are really specific to your local community and specific to agriculture. Some of the benefits that specifically help agriculture are roads, schools, fire departments, agencies that receive funding, including Cornell Cooperative Extension Associations, and also agricultural economic development. You know, when a new agricultural company is looking at starting a new location, you know, especially if they're selling some kind of an agricultural product, they're most likely going to be taking a good look at census data to see what the population demographics are for that area. And the more people, generally, the better for all of these things. So we're getting into the real heart of the presentation. What are some special considerations that we should be thinking of as we talk to people in agricultural communities about the census? So, you know, both Judd and I, our primary job is not to do outreach about the census, you know, but we're engaging in some conversations here and there and hoping other people will do so as well. So when we talk about Spanish-speaking farm workers, just to give you a little bit of background, I'm working in 9 counties from Ontario County West. The workers on dairy farms in my area are predominantly from Mexico, although there are also a lot from Guatemala, and there's more from Guatemala getting into the central New York region. On dairy farms, these workers are mostly year-round. They're more seasonal on fruit and vegetable farms and in vineyards. They're predominantly young and single men, or at least men who are living in the U.S. without their spouses. Over the years, there have been more and more families, especially the year-round workers. So people that have either married locally or brought their families up to live with them. As far as those from Mexico and Guatemala, they mostly speak Spanish, although there are a number, especially from southern Mexico and Guatemala, that speak Spanish only as a second language. Their first language is a Mayan language, so an indigenous language like Tzotzil or Mixteco, and I think Nahuatl is actually an Aztec language from a little bit northern, further, or not quite as far south in Mexico. So when we're thinking about the census and these folks, the first thing is just awareness. Do they even know what's going on? Personally, the farm workers I've talked to, most of them have heard about it, but they probably, there's just not as much culturally use of mail, so they may not check the mailbox at their house. They may not answer the door to a stranger like a census enumerator. So maybe they've heard it's going on, but they personally haven't had a direct connection to how to fill out the survey. Another potential barrier to completing the census is really understanding what it is. In Mexico and Guatemala, they also complete a census every 10 years, generally via home visits. However, Mexican and Guatemalan immigrants living in the US might not quite understand what the purpose of our census is. They might think that they, as immigrants who are planning to return to their home country at some point, should not be counted. So those are just some of the very, very basic things, knowing that it's going on and knowing that it's something that they should take part in. Next, another barrier to completing the census is concerns about immigration status. So immigrant farm workers may have an array of different citizenship statuses, and anywhere, they may be anything other than a permanent citizen. They may be working on adjusting their status. They might have a green card, have temporary status. So there's been a lot of news coverage over the past year leading up to the initiation of the census, a lot of talk about the citizenship question. There was a big push to add a question to the census that would ask, are you a citizen of the United States? Folks that are not a citizen might be a little bit wary about answering that question on a government form. And in addition, there's a lot of fear of information being passed on to authorities. So, you know, as we went over the questions, they're pretty basic, but there's still definitely some fear over that question out there. However, the Census Bureau, this is directly from their website, and the Census Bureau is bound by Title 13 of the U.S. Code to keep your information confidential. This law protects your answers to the 2020 census. Under Title 13, the Census Bureau cannot release any identifiable information about you, your home, or your business, even to law enforcement agencies. The law ensures that your private data is protected and that your answers cannot be used against you by any government agency or court. Violating Title 13 is a federal crime punishable by prison time and/or a fine of up to $250,000. So right from the Census Bureau, that's very clear information showing that everything is private and cannot be used against someone. So just talking through that with somebody before completing the census might help them feel more comfortable with the process. Another concern among immigrant farm workers is about immigration status are concerns about public charge. Now, you may have heard in the news over the past year some discussion about this term, public charge. Basically, the idea of public charge and immigration is that aliens are inadmissible to the United States if they are unable to care for themselves without being public charges. So this is something that has been around for a long time. Last year in August, Department of Homeland Security published a final ruling about how exactly this is determined, and it was implemented on February 24th of 2020. So to back up a minute, what this means is that if somebody is in the United States on a temporary visa and they want to adjust their status to get a green card and eventually apply for citizenship, when they're filling out or if they're living outside the country and applying to be able to come into the US on some type of visa, they're going to have to show on their application that they're not going to become a public charge and require public benefits in order to make it in the country. This has always been out there, but it was just made very clearly how this is determined this year. So for example, if an immigrant is using SNAP benefits, Section 8 housing, Medicaid, they would most likely be determined as ineligible for adjusting their status in the US and becoming a citizen. There are some other things that, like if a child is receiving benefits, if they're on WIC, women, infants, and children, that kind of thing, if it's medical, health in an emergency or crisis, then they would not be considered a public charge. However, just this whole discussion has been rather confusing, and a lot of immigrants are concerned about if becoming a public charge or anything that would make them inadmissible to become a citizen eventually. So just knowing that the census is a government form and it has something to do with aid, again, it's aid to the community, not to the person. I think that's where the misunderstanding has come in, that some people just don't want to touch it, thinking that it might affect their ability to become a citizen eventually. Seems like a little bit of a leap, but it's definitely a concern that's out there. These are some flyers that are on the census website, and you can see the Spanish version of this flyer says specifically that your information is protected. Nobody can share your information with anybody in the government, including ICE, FBI, or police. So it's something the census is aware of as a barrier and are actively trying to kind of get rid of that concern and that lack of trust. So once we get past kind of the barriers of why someone just might not know about it, might not want to do it, they might just not understand the importance. So having a little discussion about how it can impact them, how schools, roads, fire departments, parks, and also local health clinics that have some federal funding. That's a big one that farm workers tend to access. Next, just having the time and space to actually complete the census. I mentioned, familiarity with the U.S. mail. They might have a mailbox, but not know how to address an envelope or buy stamps. As far as doing the online survey, they may or may not have a computer, smartphone, tablet, and Wi-Fi connectivity. They also, I was talking through this with a farm worker and got to the realization that they just had never done an online survey. So I was kind of making a leap to, here's your phone, here's the website, and they just didn't quite, I had to break it down more for them to understand exactly how it would work for them. All right, well, that is my summary of the Spanish-speaking community. And I'm going to pass it over to Judd to do his part. And Judd, just let me know when you want me to advance your slides.
Okay, great. Thanks, Libby. And you can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. And thanks to Tim and CC Ontario and Libby for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm going to speak about Mennonite and Amish communities that we often call plain communities. That's a term that comes from that population, so it's okay to use that. And how a little bit about those communities, kind of surface level cultural and demographic aspects, and how they fit possibly into the census. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to start with the Amish, which are perhaps the more visible or well-known of the plain groups. In New York, we have 58 distinct settlements and a total population in 2020 well over 20,000 people. New York is the state with the highest percentage in population growth over the last decade, and it looks like it will continue to grow with these people. Next slide, please. This is a spatial distribution of Old Order or Amish and Mennonite populations throughout New York State. It's a little bit dated now. There'd be a few more dots there, but each one of those dots represents a horse and buggy group. And we can see Ontario County here has a number of dots in it. Thank you very much, Libby, for that. Highlighting where Ontario County is. Next slide, please. And in Ontario County, those horse and buggy populations are quite specifically what we call Old Order Mennonites, which are distinct from the Amish from a cultural and religious perspective, but they share a number of commonalities with the Amish as well, including English being a second language, second to something called Pennsylvania Dutch or Pennsylvania German, the use of a horse and buggy, distinctive dress, and restrictive church standards on technology. There are a number of different groups that make up the Old Order Mennonites. The largest one nationally, as well as within New York State, is called the Groffdale Conference. And recently there was a division that created a group called the Midwest Conference. And this group of people nationally is well over 20,000 people. Within Ontario County, we're probably looking at an order of maybe 100 or 200 families, each one of those families being around 10 people per household. Next slide, please. And this is just to reinforce kind of some of the cultural distinctives of this group that we find in Ontario County. Use of a horse and buggy, but that is coupled with the technology of tractors, which makes them unique. Next slide, please. How does this group fit into the horse and buggy population throughout New York State? It's a really unique group in terms of how quickly they grew. They moved from the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area into Yates County in the mid-1970s. That population grew very rapidly over the following decades and expands now into Yates, Ontario, Steuben, and Schuyler counties. Today, that population is probably around 750 households. As people continue to get married, that adds to that. Marriage season for these people tends to be, excuse me, in the spring and in the fall. So we're that data of 730 is from early spring or late winter 2020. So we're probably past 750 at this point. And what's unique here is the number of parochial schoolhouses. This is the largest horse and buggy settlement of Mennonites outside of Lancaster, PA. And this group of people continues to move throughout New York State into other areas such as Herkimer and Malone. Next slide, please. When we talk about the Amish and the Mennonite populations, it's important to understand that there's a tremendous amount of diversity among those populations. And that diversity is composed of highly discrete groups of people that self-identify around a set of practices. And so although there's a continuum of, say, dress and technology acceptance among those people, we have to understand that each step on that continuum is highly defined, and the people within one group, although they may look to the casual observer to be similar to other groups, are actually separated by very specific church boundaries. And here what I'm illustrating is one of those boundaries. And so these black bumper vehicles here and black vehicles represent a group called the Horning Mennonites. A number of these people are within Ontario County, as well as Yates and Seneca County as well, and very active in agriculture. And again, to the casual observer, they may outwardly appear fairly similar to the horse and buggy Mennonites. However, they are a very distinct group from them in that they use automobiles for transportation. And next slide. Oh, wow, look at that. They have rubber tire tractors, and this, of course, leads to a larger scale of agriculture, as you can see. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, Libby, this one has, you have to populate the, yeah, thank you. I'd also like to point out that then there are smaller groups which are probably confusing to outsiders. These would include what we call Beachy Amish, which are actually Amish people that drive automobiles, Eastern Conference Mennonites, so on and so forth. So the young women that you see in this slide, although they have what we call plain dress, they may very well have a Facebook account or maybe a TikTok, I don't know. The point here is that it's difficult to make assumptions on technology or group identity based on appearance unless you're fairly familiar with the dress standards of each group. Next slide, please. Okay, so how does this create challenge for the census, which is what we're supposed to be talking about here today? With the Amish and Mennonites, it's quite clear that their values at times are not the values that we may find in mainstream society. For example, highly distinct gender roles, language, and what I meant there with language is the type of language we use, not necessarily Pennsylvania Dutch versus English, but the type of vocabulary we might employ in our language. In other words, well, I'll leave it there. And then of course, dress. So this can create challenges, say, for a census worker or any other type of outreach worker, whether it's healthcare or ag service providers. How do we effectively navigate those differences between mainstream values on those topics, and what are the internal values around those topics for the populations? And there's not a right or wrong there. I just simply want to acknowledge that those are challenges that may restrict participation in, say, an effort such as the census. Of course, separation from mainstream society is actually one of the key components to maintaining their cultures. So participation in something such as the census, which, as you could see from the literature that Libby shared, the communication there is that participation in this is for the greater good of society. These people see themselves as distinct from mainstream society. There's probably less motivation to complete that. I also feel there's a higher degree of privacy on a personal and family levels than there probably is in mainstream society, and that could interfere with participation. And then within those cultures, there are existing social support systems around things such as social well-being, healthcare, food, education. There are internal networks to provide for their members on all of those different issues. And so that may also decrease participation or the motivation to participate. And then distrust of intent. This is really no different than what Libby was sharing with Hispanic populations that might be concerned about how is this information being used. And while we're on that topic, I would say that that distrust of intent is also very common among mainstream potential census respondents. Next slide, please. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is encourage you, if you're interested, to take a deeper dive into this subject matter. And so I thought I would share some potential resources. This is meant as a joke, this slide with the Amish Mafia and then this novel. Amish Mafia is a reality TV show, and my message to you is that reality television is not real. And so do not believe what you see on screen when it comes to the Amish or the Mennonites for that matter. I would encourage you to seek more scholarly information. The next slide, please. Thanks, Libby. Here are a couple of excellent books written by people who've dedicated their careers to studying these populations. The one on the left discusses a number of different Amish populations in New York State, and then the one on the right discusses the horse and buggy Mennonites more on a national scale, but it would help the reader considerably understand the populations that we find in a place such as Ontario County. And I think that's it for me, Libby. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Judd.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so in closing, there's been a lot going on in the news, what with COVID and all, but the census, they have, to the best of my knowledge, they have decided to close the census September 30th rather than into October. So time is of the essence. We've just got a couple weeks left. And, really the whole point of this presentation is to encourage any of you that may have interactions with these populations, or I guess even interactions with people that have interactions with them, is that just a simple conversation with someone that they trust could really encourage or motivate someone to complete the census. And I would say, personally, I've been just bringing this up when I'm on farms, chatting with Hispanic farm workers, and I'm not thinking that everyone is going to run out and complete the census after they talk to me, but, it could just push someone a little bit more in that direction of feeling comfortable with it and understanding it, and then maybe getting to the next step of completion. So that is really the information that Judd and I put together to share with you folks today. If anybody has questions at this point, we'll open it up. You could either use the chat box, or we could also unmute you.
Libby, while we're waiting for questions, I'm Tim Davis from Cooperative Extension in Ontario County. We do have electronic copies of the flyers that Libby showed that we can email you if you're interested. We also have posters and other information. So if you are looking for something to be able to use on your farm, or another location, please let us know and we will email those to you. I will put my email in the chat section, for you. And then Libby, I need to identify one of our participants. I don't have a name. It shows up as NT375's iPhone. If we can identify that person, that would be wonderful.
Hi, Tim. This is Nicole Tamel. I actually had to switch from my computer to my iPhone because I had to duck out. So I wanted to listen to this. So it's Nicole Tamel. I'm
Beautiful.
the Farm Business Management Specialist from the Central New York Dairy, Field Crops, and Livestock team.
Great. Thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome.
Super. Yeah, if anybody has questions about the census or anything related, feel free to speak up. Or maybe Judd and I just did such a good job, you're left without questions.
I had a quick question, if no one else has any questions. What is your sense of current participation among the either community with the census? When you ask them, are they saying, oh yeah, I've already filled it out, or do most of them say no?
I guess, you know, this is very informal and unscientific, but I haven't met any farm workers yet who have completed it in that community. Judd?
I think it is, Eric, is probably about on par with the English population among the plain groups is what I would say. And that some people have, some people haven't. Some people don't remember if they have, right? Because we all get a lot of things in the mail. And I think there's a bit of a misconception that the plain populations don't want to do this. And I don't know that I agree with, there are individuals that don't want to, but I think there's also individuals in the general population that don't want to. So I think it's probably about average with the rest of society for the groups I was speaking about. It's none of my business, but I think that Libby's more the expert, but I would guess it is there. It's probably a bigger challenge to reach that population. Yeah. These people that I'm working with have properties with deeds and bank accounts and permanent mailing addresses and all of those things. And their children are attending schools. They're probably more firmly rooted, and I don't mean that in a negative way at all, because I do see personally and professionally that the Hispanic labor force and other components of that labor force are increasingly valuable members of our communities, including in the rural part of New York State. But the Amish and the Mennonites have probably more stable living situations oftentimes.
I think that's a real fair assessment, Judd. I mean, my observations of Hispanic workforce across Western New York, specifically on dairies, like I said, there's more and more that are married and have kids and are, because of that, more, rooted in the local community. They're, interacting with schools and other parents and are less likely to move around as much. Whereas the younger single men tend to be, I would call them immigrants because they're here generally for a number of years as opposed to migrant. They're not migrating with the season, but they do tend to be a little bit less rooted and more likely to move around from job to job based on opportunities and pay and that kind of thing. But then I'll let Tim comment, but the reason that we gave this webinar is that in Ontario County, these two populations were specifically noted as, I think, just populations that may not respond, or, areas that they live in have had lower response rates so far, I believe.
The Ontario County Planning Department receives information on completion of the census. Ontario County happens to be a little bit below average for New York State. They are able to identify the townships that are low. One of them happens to be Gorham. And that was, the thought maybe is it may be related to the Plains communities. But I also know in talking, to a gentleman from the community, there's been a number of families that have recently completed the census.
Great.
Whereas I think in some of the other communities that are being identified as low, they're more of the rural communities with the thought that it could be connected, to the migrant, immigrant, farm worker population. So our planning department has put a priority on those audiences as some of the, they've also identified other hard to reach audiences. Those that are urban, a little bit less financially secure, Spanish speaking. So there's a number of audiences the planning department has highlighted as a hard to reach audience. And the Plains community and the migrant farm worker communities are two of those.
One thing too, I wonder, Tim, is that more and more people are probably filling this out online, and so that kind of tips the scale on a percentage basis. Even if you're, how can I word that? In other words, if among a certain population, a higher percentage are doing that online, the people who don't have access to the online version, logically, you're going to have a lower response rate, I guess.
We've got a question here about, since we only have a few weeks left, what recommendations do we have as to how to best reach these audiences besides when we're on farm? I guess locally what we've done here, Tim has led the charge, and we've done a mailing out to farmers in the county. I think maybe it went to all farmers, or but anyways, so just sending out some resources. We did like a bilingual article. We sent some of the flyers, and then also a cover letter just saying like, hey, did you know this is really a benefit to agriculture? So hoping that will give some people a little extra nudge.
And we will make this webinar available on the, I think it's the YouTube channel for the Northwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops team. So that will be available. What we're looking to do in Ontario County is to then be able to send the webinar out to our farm operators along with the other resources. The census has provided us both in Spanish and English to be able to promote with, farm workers. I do think the Plains communities will be a little bit different. As Judd mentioned, they may not have access to computers. We are reaching out to see if we can have a message put out on their hotline phone calls, which are held once a week. Thankfully, we have a gentleman from the community serving on our Ag Enhancement Board who was willing to do that once and has done that. We are also looking at trying to arrange to have census takers attend the Ontario produce auction and have them right there where they could then be able to, complete the census, on site. And then I think we may ultimately also look at putting an article in their Flame newsletter, an ad, encouraging completion. But again, as I understand, the Plains community, is interested in completing the census, and is just becoming, more aware of how to be able to do that.
Thanks, Tim. Any other last questions or comments?
There's a comment from Lisa asking, do all planning departments in each county receive this data? I can't answer that, Lisa. I am not sure. My guess is someone in the county is receiving the information. It may be in Ontario County that responsibility has been given to our planning department. And they've been very good at reaching out to organizations like Cooperative Extension that they feel can reach these populations. Unfortunately, New York State originally asked for proposals from counties on how to reach harder to reach populations. And that was back at the beginning of the year. New York State then turned around and said, no, we're not funding anybody now. And then only about a month ago, if even that, they then contacted counties and say, yes, we have funding available. Please try to find organizations to reach these communities. So that is part of the reason why a lot of this is coming at you at very last minute.
Tim, I remember finding online, this is not super helpful, but somewhere on the census website, you can look up who in every community in the US is in charge of leading the outreach for the census. And I think it just, there's like a map and you can look up your local area. So I think it just kind of depends based on where you are located.
Lisa, if you also email me, with your county, I can ask Linda Phillips from the Ontario County Planning Department. She is the lead for the census in our county. I can ask her, if she knows of the lead organization in your county to be able to work with.
Well, I think seeing no more questions, we will come to a close here. Thanks again, Judd, for your help. Thanks, Tim, for reaching out to us and helping put this together. Like Tim said, we'll have this up on the Northwest New York Dairy Team's YouTube channel by the end of the day.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye now.
Thanks.